Less than that.
Yes.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
We're going to start because we have a lot to cover and we'll allow time for questions. And I know that time is short. I was involved with a recent study that's taken up the last 4 years of my life, looking at our specific churches in our denomination, particularly. What makes up a missions active church? What contributes to it? Why are some churches more engaged and involved in missions than others? Just for a little bit historical perspective for you, the General Conference, our denomination started as an ethnic church. Do you know what ethnic group we were from? German Reformed, that's correct. And it's my understanding that in the earliest churches they spoke German. And for a number of years after that, there were still some churches that spoke German. Domestic missionary zeal resulted in more than 2,500 churches being established across the country. Ed says it's probably higher than that. I was taking my figures from what Jim Moss had written some years ago. But Ed thinks it could be close to 3,000, stretched from East Coast to West Coast. Okay? And Ed says it's not unusual, that kind of fact when you look at where we are today, because in most denominations, they have had a lot of churches, more churches established than what's in existence presently for them. Okay? I noted that in studying the history that 70 years passed before the very first overseas missionary was sent out by this evangelical denomination. And at the very heart of being an evangelical denomination, it means we believe in the gospel. We believe that everybody needs to hear the gospel, that Jesus Christ is the only way to salvation. So it seems kind of strange that it took that long before the very first missionary was sent out. Who was that first missionary? Claire Landis from what conference? Iowa Conference, that's correct. And pretty much for most of those years, from the very first missionary going out in 1896 to the work in India beginning in 1898, through the next century, there were really three major fields: India, and then what developed as Bangladesh, and then Haiti, which started in 1967. There was a work in Czechoslovakia at one time. But there was not much overseas involvement beyond that. My understanding was there was a day where when people came to the Commission on World Missions, as it was known at one time, that if you wanted to be a missionary, if you weren't interested in going to India, Bangladesh, Haiti, or the Southwest, we weren't interested in talking to you. That day is no longer in existence. But in 1994 is when who went out from us to start a new field? The 80s to Brazil, that's correct. Is that what you said? I'm giving you the benefit of the doubt. However, I have to summarize and say that neither the size nor the history of the General Conference supports the notion that the denomination has been engaged intensely in fulfilling the Great Commission. When you look at our size and you look at our history, you have to conclude we've really not been that involved in. And that's a sad statement to make, but it's true. My own theological perspective is that all congregations need to be engaged at some level in making disciples among other people groups. But the reality is that many churches, and this is general, not just our denomination, but others as well, many churches determine either intentionally or through neglect that cross-cultural outreach is optional rather than an essential practice. I grew up in the Sunday school. I was taught that Jesus gave us the Great Commission, and that the Old Testament has nothing to do with missions. Missions begins in the New Testament era. I wish I knew then, had been taught then, what I know today. And what I know today is that God gave the Great Commission originally to Abram in Genesis chapter 12. He called a particular people group that they might be blessed and be a blessing to the nations. missions is everywhere in the Old Testament. And Jesus comes along, he repeats the Great Commission and sends out his disciples to take that message. Now, give you an example of this, how we neglect it, is that, and I'm sorry, upstairs when we were originally set up, we had a very bright projector, but here not. So in 2010, 50 of our churches contributed 70% of our designated missions funds. What does that say to you? Speak to me.
A lot of work to be done.
A lot of work to be done.
Not enough churches involved.
Not enough churches involved. You know, you've heard the old principle, and it's true in the local churches, like 20% of the people do 80% of the work, 20% of the people give 80% of the money. And when you look at 50 churches contributing 70%, that's sad and it's disappointing. So as I entered on this project, the central research question was, what factors lead some of our churches to excel more than others in cross-cultural missions participation? You know, why are some so engaged and others not? What do missions active churches have in common? Are there some factors that all those that are highly engaged that they have in common? And then what can other churches learn from the mission policies and the practices of those churches? And if they put those into practice, could also become a missions active church. Now, as a part of my project, I did a thorough research of Scripture, Old Testament and New Testament, in terms of what it says about God's heart for the nations and what the responsibility that God's people have to make Him known, to expand the glory, to declare His glory to other peoples, to expand the fame of God's name. And I also looked beyond the biblical scriptural evidence. I looked at research in terms of precedent literature, other literature that had been written about missions active churches. And what I found was there were 8 common characteristics among missions active churches. The pastoral staff of those churches were highly supportive of missions. They preached about missions, they promoted missions, they were a champion or a cheerleader for missions. Every one of those churches it has a missions leadership team or a missions committee that's spearheading the effort in the local church. They value that ministry is not just a program for them, but they think and they breathe missions all the time, and they let everybody in the church know about it. These are not our churches. This is other literature that's been written about Christians, the evangelical community. Okay, missions education was a high priority in all of those mission active churches. And then it says to us that if we want to be missions active churches, we've got to value missions education and do whatever we can to promote missions. Missionary care was important. That these mission active churches in all kinds of denominations understood that if they supported a missionary, it had to happen not just with finances, but certainly with prayer and with connection, with communication, with encouragement, whether they're on the field or when they come home on furlough. Prayer was a vital part of these mission active churches. They really lifted up their missionaries in prayer on a continual basis. They were involved in mobilizing workers, not just short-term missions teams going out, but these mission active churches were also sending missionaries into other fields and other cultures. And some of the larger mission active churches did even work through a denomination or a missions organization. They were sending out their own missionaries and caring for them and administrating all of that. Missions funding was a priority. Missions active churches historically have given lots of money. And years ago, when I became familiar with the Faith Promise plan of missions giving, I heard about People's Church in Toronto, Canada, where the pastor Smith, promoted that way of funding missions, and a church that really wasn't that great was giving $1 million a year to missions through the Faith Promise program. And then local ethnic outreach. These mission active churches weren't just concerned globally, they were also engaged in reaching out to diverse populations all around them, focusing on international students, And I read about Park Street Church in Boston, a historic missions active church that kept their doors of their building open for long hours and had very few hours where they locked up at night, so that internationals living around them in universities could come into that facility for study, for rest, for interaction. They had people on staff and volunteers who would interact with those internationals. But mission active churches have a tendency to reach out to other cultures that are close at home, okay? So in looking at those mission active churches from what had been written about them, I determined that I needed to come up with some case studies of our own denomination. So I needed to select a group of churches, and I chose 12 mission active churches within our denomination. And some of my criteria was very objective. For example, I could go to our data file and find out what churches gave the most money to designated ministries during a 10-year period, 2001 to 2010. So I came up with a list of churches. That was easy. It wasn't something that I had to wonder, well, is this a mission active church or not? They were giving lots of money. I also analyzed those, and I came up with 25 churches. Which of these were the highest per capita giving? You understand what I'm saying when I say per capita? I looked at, for example, how much a church gave to designated ministries during the year. I divided that by the average worship attendance for that year for that church. And that came up with per capita or per member, or per attendee. Average worship attendee. And that's per capita, okay? And then I asked the question, which of these 25 churches have a track record of either sending career missionaries, sending their own members out into the field, and or were involved in sending ongoing short-term missions teams. And a lot of that we knew because of scheduling through our office, but I also knew there were churches, some of those churches and other churches, that were just doing their own thing and connecting with other organizations, which is understandable. And then I asked the question, which of these churches have a strong emphasis on global missions? So this was more subjective. Here I can look at specifics, I can look at data, I can look at very definable information that we have in our office. This was through that data, but also just awareness and knowledge. I'm putting together, this will be coming out in book form, we'll release later this year. My goal was to have it before now, but things like life and journal contents and everything else got delayed. But later this year, I've added a 13th church, which was not among our original 25, but a church that has a strong missions emphasis, and this spring had their 50th annual missions conference, and that's Central Manor Church out in the Eastern region. So that'll be a part of that. There'll be 13 of that case study. So here are the top 25 churches in designated giving in 2001 2010. And you'll see several regions represented: Eastern, Great Lakes, Midwest region, Allegheny region. If you don't know these identifiable letters, initials, and that's what that stands for. Okay. I'm sorry? I want to say yes, but they may not be. So that doesn't help you. It's close.
How many churches do we have in CCG?
According to the statistic, we have about, 340 approximately in the United States. Most of them in the Eastern.
How many are in the Western Conference? Because I don't see Western Conference on it at all. So that worries me, joining the Western Conference.
Yeah, I don't know how many's in the West.
Okay.
We have that information.
Well, I'm going to be on there in a couple of years. So
We would welcome you to our plan. Leadwood in Missouri has been a strong missions church in the past, did not make the top 25.
For that whole time period, we've done better lately.
Yes, you have. Yeah. And again, this is through 2010. But I think on the printed Ed's report that's on your keyboard in the packet, it tells how many churches in each region. So I think that's on your paper. Okay. Thank you for asking that. So I came up with these 12 select churches. Now, some of this, again, is objective in choosing. It was easy to choose, for example, Highview Church, number 10, because Highview Church was one of the leading in total designated giving and in per capita giving. They ranked up their boat. And they were sending teams out and things like that. So, you know, and you can say, well, why didn't you include Chambersburg or College First? And, you know, I could have, but I didn't. And if you want to include them, do your own study. Okay? that's Breakout. Commit 4 years of your life to it. Okay? But a number of these, you know, are strong churches, and I'm thankful for each of them. It takes all of us working together to accomplish something. So here's some conclusions of my research. All right. So I determined the average worship attendance and designated giving. From the archives, I gathered historical sketches of all the churches. I did an interview with the senior pastor of each of these 12 churches. And there were a couple occasions, because the pastor was retiring, I also interviewed the pastor who just retired as well as a new person. And for example, Olive Branch Church in Indiana, I interviewed Pastor Lowell, who'd been there forever. Not literally, but almost.
Almost. Yeah.
Almost, yeah. And Pastor Dan, who had just come on a few months before that. And I interviewed Ben, who had left Mount Pleasant Church, even though he's already on staff. And at that point, I don't think even the new pastor Brad had been chosen yet when I did the study. So I interviewed senior pastors. Okay. I interviewed the missions team leader, that is the chairman of the missions committee, chairman, chairwoman, team leader. Okay. And then I did a written survey and an interview with the missions team members. Okay, so that was all a part of the research, trying to discover what are the factors. What do missions active churches have in common? By the way, if you want printout or these PowerPoint stuff, I'll be glad to send them to you, so you don't have to lose the right. When the book comes out, it'll be one. All right, we looked at these priorities, and this was a part of the survey, based upon some of my precedent literature. Missions education, prayer, are they sending out short-term teams, missionary recruitment, funding, missionary care, and mission speakers, scheduling in mission speakers, okay? And then there were a chance for writings, okay? And then we looked at, there were 76 respondents, and I actually went to the site, was with the missions team. They filled out the survey in my presence, handed it in that day or night, because you know if you take it home, you'll never get it back. Right? So, and these were from 12 teams, 76 respondents, okay? And in almost all the cases, everybody was there. We may have had one person missing on some of them, but even though some of those came in later. So, what do you think ranked highest as priority? And these were the questions. Rank in order these aspects of the current missions ministry in your church. What do you prioritize as a missions leadership team? Number one was prayer. They thought prayer was most important. In fact, when I spent my time with the Highview team, and Tom Lefevre just retired as pastor there, they have monthly missions leadership teams, and most of the time for that missions leadership team meeting, they spend in prayer. They pray more than doing anything else. They value it. Okay? And a number of committees, even though they valued prayer, had to admit that, you know, we don't pray enough as we should, as a group. Okay? Secondly, funding. They saw a big priority as helping raise funds to support missionaries, mission projects, things like that. And third was short-term teams. They valued short-term trips. Only one of the 12 were beginning to question the amount of money that they were spending on short-term teams in terms of the benefit to the local church. But everybody else saw, great value in this. In fact, I'll say that comment later. But notice some others here. Missions education was 4 close by, and I would argue that mission education or that short-term trips is a vital part of missions education. Going and seeing for yourself, you know more. Okay. But it was interesting to me that missionary recruitment was so low. Only the one church out of the 12 that ranked missionary recruitment higher than all the rest was Olive Branch Church, which has sent out a number of missionaries. Shippensburg has also, but it's interesting. And so the question is, why don't we value? Is the local church not valuing the fact that we need to encourage people to hear the call of God, hear the call, I've heard that somewhere, hear the call and respond to full-time ministry, locally, okay? So that's where we came down. So here are some findings. I can't say strongly enough about the importance of the role of missions leadership team or missions committee. And I think we had 12 churches. I think several of them had the word team and some had committee, but there were a variety of names for their group. The truth is, and from the precedent literature as well as these, it was obvious that any missions active team has to have any missions active church has to have a missions leadership team. Now, there are a lot of churches that have missions committees that don't commit. As they said a long time ago, if the horse is dead, it's time to dismount. If we have a missions committee that's not doing anything, fire them and replace them with a group that wants to do something. Okay? This is the group in all of the 12 churches. I mean, they eat, breathe, sleep, all of this stuff. They care about it. They are committed to it. They have a passion for missionaries. They are excited about meeting together because they learn more about what God's doing as they read the letters, as they share from what they discovered in the last month. The place of missions policy. It was all over the board. But all of them had some type of written policies governing them and the decisions they made regarding missions committee and missions program in the church. Some of them had very few sentences. I mean, some of them are very loosely structured. In some churches, the whole board or the whole church votes on who's part of the missions committee. In other churches, the administrative council appoints. There's churches like KZ White Oak in Illinois that basically they recruit their own members, and whoever wants to be a part of their missions team can be a part of it. Thank you, Keith. You're a part of that.
Question.
Yes?
Does CGGC have a missions policy book that the churches have to follow as far as guidelines?
We don't. We have some suggestions, and ACMC, which is an organization advancing ACMC. Well, that's an alternative. They put out a book some years ago with suggested policies, and we'd be glad to share that with you or point you in the direction. That's been a great, I think the latest term is mission exchange.
Missio Nexus.
Yes, Missio Nexus. They're a part of Missio Nexus. Yeah. So, but these churches vary. So contact me, Heather, right?
Yes.
About that, and I'd be glad to give you some information. So some were loosely structured, but all of them had some written policy. Some were in the constitutional bylaws of the church, and others were not. The influence of persons or events in making missions a priority. This was key. In some cases, it was the founding pastor. Like a Peter Louts at Mount Pleasant Church in Allegheny region. Or a Tom Lefevre at Highview Church. Tom says, there's 2 board meetings I go to in my church. I go to our administrative council meeting, and I make sure I make every missions committee. I don't go up to any others. And it says something about what he values. Okay? So, In other cases, it's been like a later pastor. Or I could talk about Germantown Church of God in Maryland. If you've been around, you've heard, you know about that church. Dr. Gilbert came out of that church. It was Ben's father and Paul Tobias, and coupled with Dr. Gilbert, who were the driving forces to influence Germantown to be such a missions active church. So usually those kinds of people, if not the founding pastor or a later pastor who emphasizes, or some other type of event in the life of the church. Communication of missions. This comes through missions education. And they don't just put up a missions bulletin board and leave it for the next 3 or 4 years. I have visited churches that had prayer cards of missionaries who had died several years before.
It's a memorial, too.
And it wasn't a memorial.
Missionaries that aren't even on the field.
Missionaries aren't on the field anymore. They're on the field for several years. Yeah, that's a disservice. So these 12 churches, they value communication and mission. So they have people changing their missions bulletin board. They're doing announcements. We have one church, New Providence, and Lawrence Metzler was pastor there at the time for the study, and then is now at Chambersburg. Of our churches, he was the only one that says, at our announcement time, the beginning of worship service, we have about a 5-minute thing where we focus, we tell about what's happening in missions and our church's involvement. And their connection is to say to people, this is our ministry. You're a part of this ministry. And some Sundays it focuses on denominational missions, and they support other missionaries and other mission organizations and local stuff as well. But every Sunday, there's a short plug at the beginning of every worship service about what they're doing in cross-cultural ministry. So, communication. But here's another interesting factor to me. In doing these mission leadership teams, most of them said, we really need to do a better job of communication. Which says to me, those who are at the top, who are excelling above all others, they still think they're falling short. We can do a better job. And that just puffs me up so much to think of that, I just wish that was contagious among some of the other churches. So, it was just wonderful. The role of the pastor in prioritizing missions. Again, we come back to that. Preaching series of messages on missions. Allowing missionaries to come in or other mission speakers to speak during the part of the worship service and or speak during the sermon time. Pastors can be blockers of this, but they can also help facilitate this kind of awareness. So the role of pastor is key. We have a hard time getting in some doors of churches because the pastor doesn't want us. Which means that when pastors take the ordination vows, they're either deceiving or lying or something. Because they take the vow to support all aspects and ministries of the denomination. So hold them accountable. The role of pastor. Denominational loyalty engagement. This was interesting. There was a question on the survey. 11 of the 12 churches said the information that comes to them from the denominational office about missions usually, and there's the criteria, usually influences the decisions they make about missions programs. One church says often, and that's the largest church, Hanover, and their missions committee is a people from a variety of backgrounds, and they're connected in lots of different ways, and I understand that. So I'm not offended by that at all, but to say, and most of them say usually, I feel good about that. Okay? So there was a loyalty, and there were those who said they very much value the information they get from us. It helps them to make the decisions. The factor of church size. This was interesting. Among the top 20, the 12 was our largest church, Hanover. A number of churches were between 120 and 170 people. And the smallest church of the 12 was Duncannon, which for that 10-year period averaged 64 people in Sunday morning worship. So what it says to me is, you don't have to be a large church to support missions or to be a mission backward church. You can be a smaller church. Okay? Recommendations. Oh, man. Based on biblical evidence, cross-cultural missions is neither optional nor in competition with local outreach. Every one of these 12 churches were highly engaged in local outreach. Every one. In fact, a pastor, like the pastor of Hanover, Jerry Shope, talked about the spiritual vitality that has come to their church because they continue to grow in their cross-cultural outreach globally. He saw it as a positive factor in the spiritual vitality of his church. And it helped him with local outreach. So it's not either or, but it's both and. And the precedent literature about local ethnic outreach backed that up, as well as these churches. By the way, 3 of the 12, I interviewed pastors. They used the term, I didn't put it in their word in their mouth, they said, missions is a part of the DNA of our church. It's built in. Okay? Secondly, churches of all sizes should be motivated that a meaningful mission ministry is possible. Again, a smaller church can't do everything, but a smaller church can do something. And so choosing where God would have you be involved and be plugged in, it's important to do it. And you can have a meaningful ministry. Thirdly, there is no perfect way to do missions. Because these churches vary in the way they communicate missions locally, on the policies, on how they structure their committees to make those decisions. There's no one way. So you have freedom to do it. The important thing is the job gets done. Missions is not just one program among others, but a foundation for all ministry. In missions education, the missions leadership team realized that we've got to educate about missions, and we do it at the local level and at the lowest level with children. So they got children's programs, they got teens involved, they got adults involved. And they didn't see themselves as a program in the church. They saw it as what they do is foundational. They want to infiltrate every aspect, every program in the life of the church. To have a global mindset of bringing greater glory to God. 5, for the most part, our churches have done a much better job of uniting their efforts to send missionaries to the field than in supporting them after they arrive. There's a lot of enthusiasm. Oh, we get this new missionary when we get into the field. But even these mission-active churches realize we don't pray for these people as we should. We are doing it, but we should do more. And we should provide more missionary care for them. And the truth is, and I'll say in my next section when I'm in the big auditorium, we have some that are underfunded. And so we need that ongoing commitment. We get a lot of one-time gifts to get missionaries to the field. We need ongoing support. I'd rather you give more money to fewer missionaries than try to do a little dab here and there. Drill Cream used to say, little dab will do that. That's dating myself. 6, all churches will benefit from the greater faith we exercise in financially supporting missions. Interesting discovery, whether you talk about faith promise or giving out of your budget, and here again, the differences. Hanover, everything is one general budget. They do one major, I think, the last Sunday of every year, the whole offering that Sunday goes to missions. And it's up about $25,000. But other churches do it budget-wise, some do it faith promise outside the budget. But in every case, the local regular budget was also increasing. It didn't take anything away from the local budget. As they gave more to missions, churches were being able to find more funds for their own ministry. So it benefits greater faith, or faith growth. The attitude of the pastor is most often the determining factor in how missions active churches, how mission actively live out. That's just repeating what was said. It's so important. And I don't think it's done enough, but when you're looking at candidates, of all the questions you ask, you need to ask you a question. What do you think about missions? How often do you preach about missions? Have you ever been on a short-term missions team? If you're not asking those kinds of questions, then I think you are limiting what God wants to do in through your people. The future of missions depends in part on the role of the local church in preparing a generation of new missionaries. We've got to help our churches understand that they're involved in recruitment. It's just not our job in the denominational office, but you need to identify prayerfully, ask that God will raise up from your midst people who will be going out as workers in the harvest, locally and globally. Now, any dissertation that's done in a project like this, you're always looking for what are some recommendations for future researchers. One of mine I put on the list was mission education and preparation of pastors. You can get a 3-year seminary degree and not take a missions course. It's not required. Now, I do teach in the MDiv program here, of course, every summer, church and mission. And we look at the biblical basis of mission, God's mission. We look at a little bit of history, but we look about the theology of mission and how we live out that mission locally in our own community, as well as how we're to be engaged globally. So it's a very foundational course. I taught as a part of PTI and the MACD program, and some of you, like John, have suffered through that. But it's not required. And the question is, why not? Why don't we require our pastors to have a mission? There's no reason. I mean, the reason why so many of them are not engaged or involved or are prioritizing it is because they've never been taught that it's in the Scriptures. The ethnic heritage of the church. If we come from an ethnic church, why have we not been more engaged in ethnic ministry through our history? That would be an interesting study. The age of mission active churches. The youngest church of our 12 mission active churches was Highview Church, which I think was founded in 1979. And part of Ben's job description is to focus on newer churches, trying to get them more engaged in missions. And Heather, I'm so glad we talked last night, you have a heart for that. Newer churches need to be involved in some aspect of cross-cultural outreach. So we have newer church plants that are part of these mission active churches. Generational shift in missions leadership. Most of the missions leadership team members of those 76 who took part in the surveys, most of them were over 50 years old. Only 2 churches had more men on their committee than women. That was Hanover and Highview. And if in your congregation, the attitude is missions, that's what the women do, and they've done a good job at it, but if that's what women do, then men and others will check out. The others will be different generations. There's men and women period. That's a joke that didn't go over. Generational. So, Central Manor has a teenager. Or I should say young adult. She's probably 21 on her mission leadership team. Highview has 2 teams. Now, if we want to get younger people excited about missions, then let's bring them on the mission leadership team. They make input, and they can connect with their generation more effectively than older people. I've done that. At least I'm done. We're supposed to be back together what time?
Be over there at 10:25.
Okay, 10:35?
35, yeah.
Okay, we have about 2 minutes. Questions? Yes?
These mission leadership teams were not the CGWM.
I'm saying if the missions team is the CGWM, then you're not going to engage as many people in your church as you could. Because they don't represent the whole church. So I think it puts a barrier. There may be exceptions to that, but I'd say in most cases that's the case.
Okay.
Yes.
When I was growing up, the emphasis was to develop pastors, encourage young people to be pastors and to be missionaries and go out in the world. That time was
Yeah.
Bangladesh and India.
Right.
And the second thing is, when I read the scriptures, men are leading things, not the women. So I'm like, men need to step up to the plate and be leaders.
You heard it from a woman. Yes.
Well, Don, in your studies and your surveys, did you see the churches that were the more Church of God givers towards missions ministry were also same involved in non-Church of God ministries?
I would say the larger the church, the more that was the case.
Okay.
Olive Branch, Hanover, certainly others. I mean, the larger missions program you have, you're going to have, when we were at Indian Village Church and we had a Faith Promise Missions program there, we connected with some missionaries who were relatives to members of our church, things like that. That happens, and that's fine. So I would say the larger the church, my studies proved that that was the case. And I'm not saying we have to limit it to Church of God missionaries, but guess what? The Baptist churches aren't going to support our missionaries. We can work together to support other faith mission organizations that are non-denominational. But if we want our denominational missionaries to be supported, guess what? It's going to be Church of God people who do it. And I have a startling fact for you when we're over in the other room. John?
The Baptist churches are not going to support our missionaries, but Tony and I's largest giving church is a non-denominational church outside of our conference.
Yes, that's right. We found that their money does spend too. and we can cash their checks, and it does help. We're getting, especially in Haiti, we're just getting thousands and thousands of dollars in support from other groups, even non-Christian groups, from universities that are connecting with our work, and it's an exciting day to be a part. Yes.
One more and I'll shut up, Don.
Yes.
Sorry. And this, I could ask you this afterwards. Do you have a Faith Promise package that can be, that we can grab a hold of and teach? Olive Branch's newest pastor, which you may have not met, doesn't have that in him yet.
On my table out here, we have Faith Promise brochure that explains it, and we can provide more information than that. We'd be glad to come and have gone into churches and talk about Faith Promise. We'd be glad to do that. Or this kind of thing. I'd be glad to meet with missions leadership teams and talk about this, and we'll make the resource available to churches when it's published later this year. Thank you for asking. Folks, thank you for coming. I appreciate it so much. Thank you.